Chapter 1. The Unexpected Proposal. The sun had already set on the small outpost where Rhea lived, casting long shadows across the barren desert landscape that stretched out beyond the edges of her city. The heat of the day lingered in the air, an oppressive warmth that made even the night feel heavy, thick with the remnants of the sweltering afternoon. The wind had started to pick up, carrying with it the fine dust from the vast plains that surrounded the settlement. It swept through the cracked streets and the dilapidated buildings like a quiet, invisible force. The world around her felt vast, empty, and uncaring, yet in the quiet moments of dusk, it felt almost alive. She'd spent most of her life here, on this desolate planet at the edge of a forgotten star system. There was no glittering metropolis or towering buildings, no luxuries of the life she had once dreamed about. Just dry, cracked earth beneath her feet, endless plains on one side, and the harsh light of the twin moons on the other, shining down on the crumbling remnants of a place that had seen better days. Rhea's life had never been easy. It was one of constant struggle and rejection, a life shaped by survival rather than hope. She had grown up in the dust and dirt of this forgotten corner of the universe, raised by a mother who had passed away when she was still too young to remember, and a father who had abandoned her before she could even understand what love was. As a child, she had often sat in the corner of the dusty, run-down house she'd lived in, wondering what life might have been like if her family hadn't fallen apart. If only the world had given her the chance to be like the others. The thought seemed too absurd even to entertain, so she let it go, focusing instead on the here and now, the reality of a life that was far from ideal. She was an outsider in every sense. An orphan, an outcast, someone who had no true place in this world. The city around her was one of constant motion, people coming and going, ships landing and departing in a frantic race for whatever scraps could be salvaged from this godforsaken planet. And yet, Rhea had never been part of that rush, never been a part of the frantic energy that filled the streets with purpose. Instead, she worked quietly in a mechanic's workshop on the edge of town, fixing whatever broken down equipment or engines the traders and travelers would leave behind. Some days, her work felt like a distant memory of something she used to love, back when she had dreams of flying among the stars, of leaving this place behind and seeing the wonders of the universe. But those dreams had long since faded into the dust. Now, she was just trying to get by, working with her hands to keep the shop running, earning just enough credits to pay the rent and buy food. The shop itself was a cramped, cluttered space, located in the back of a building that had long since seen better days. Metal parts and tools were strewn across the dusty counters and tables, and the faint smell of oil and grease lingered in the air, mixing with the ever-present scent of metal and rust. Outside, the streets were quiet, save for the occasional footstep of a passerby or the rumble of a vehicle in the distance. It wasn't much, but it was all Rhea had. And yet, it had always felt like something was missing. She could never shake the feeling that her life was meant for something more, that she was destined to escape this place, to leave behind the shackles of the city and fly freely among the stars. But that was a dream, an impossible one that had been crushed beneath the weight of the reality she lived in. Despite the bleakness of her situation, Rhea had learned to keep a certain resilience about her. She had learned how to make do with what she had, how to survive on the scraps of life that others discarded. And, over time, she had come to accept that this was her fate, that she was destined to remain in this forgotten place, where nothing ever changed, where the world spun on without care, without noticing the people like her, the ones who were invisible, the ones who had no place to belong. She had been rejected by everyone around her, by the other children at school, by the traders who came and went, by the people who lived in the city. She had learned to hide her emotions, to keep to herself, because showing any vulnerability only made her a target for ridicule and rejection. So she kept quiet, kept to herself, and worked in the shadows. It was easier that way, to remain unnoticed. But today, something felt different. As Rhea worked in the shop, fixing a broken-down engine for one of the few regular customers she had, a thought began to creep into her mind. It was a fleeting thought, but it grew in her chest as the hours wore on, until it was impossible to ignore. She had been thinking about her life, about what had become of her dreams, about how hopeless it all felt. And then, in the middle of her work, the door to the shop opened with a loud creak, breaking her concentration. She didn't even look up at first, assuming it was just another customer who needed a quick fix. But then she heard the voice, and something inside her froze. "Are you the mechanic?" the voice asked, deep and steady, with a slight foreign accent. Ria looked up, her hands instinctively wiping the grease off on the cloth at her side. Standing in the doorway was a man, tall, with dark hair and intense eyes that seemed to pierce through her. He was dressed in a rugged, weathered outfit, with the unmistakable marks of someone who had been through a lot. His clothes, though simple, were of good quality, and his demeanor radiated confidence, something Ria was not used to seeing in the people who wandered through this place. But what struck her most was his presence. There was something about him that felt different from anyone she had ever met. He didn't look like the usual smugglers or traders who came and went. He looked like someone who belonged to a different world entirely. "Yes," Ria replied, her voice more guarded than she intended. "I am. What do you need?" He stepped inside, looking around the cluttered shop with an appraising gaze. "I need a fix for my ship. It's been running rough for a while, and I don't trust anyone else around here to do the job." Ria nodded and stood, wiping her hands on the rag as she gestured for him to follow her to the workbench. But there was something about the way he moved, the way he carried himself, that set him apart from everyone else. He was too calm, too composed, as if he didn't belong in this dusty, run-down shop. Ria had seen men like him before: daring adventurers, smugglers, people with wealth or power, people who lived on the fringes of society, with little care for the struggles of those like her. As she worked, she noticed how intently he watched her, his eyes never leaving her hands as she worked the tools. It was disconcerting, but Ria did her best to ignore it. It wasn't unusual for men to watch her work. They often did, either out of curiosity or admiration for her skills. But this man, he was different. He wasn't just interested in her mechanics. There was something else in his gaze, something that Ria couldn't quite place. "I'm sorry," he said after a few minutes of silence, his voice softer now, almost hesitant. "I've been traveling for a long time. I've seen a lot of worlds, but none like this." Ria looked up at him, her brow furrowing. "What do you mean?" "Nothing," he said quickly, shaking his head. "I'm sorry. It's just, you're not like the others around here. You're different." She couldn't help but laugh, though it wasn't a joyful sound. "Different? How?" "You don't belong here," he said, almost too quickly. "You don't fit with the others in this place. It's obvious. You're not one of them. You've got ambition in your eyes. You're meant for something else." Ria froze, the words hitting her harder than she expected. She wasn't sure why, but his words, his perception, felt too accurate. They dug into the core of her insecurities, the ones she had buried so deep that even she had forgotten about them. Was he right? Was she meant for something more, or was he just another passerby with some misplaced pity? She didn't know how to respond, so she kept working in silence, her hands moving mechanically over the ship's engine. The man remained quiet, too, until the work was finished, and Ria wiped her hands on the rag, glancing at him. "Your ship's ready to go," she said, trying to push the unease from her voice. "That'll be 300 credits." He looked at her for a long moment before reaching into his bag and pulling out a small pouch of credits, handing it over without a second thought. Then, just as he turned to leave, he hesitated, his hand lingering on the doorframe. "Ria," he said, and she looked up sharply, surprised that he knew her name. "You've got more potential than you know, and if you ever want to leave this place, I can help. I can take you with me." Her heart skipped a beat, and before she could respond, he was gone, leaving only the echo of his words hanging in the air. The door creaked shut behind him with a finality that sent a shiver through Ria's spine. She stared at the empty threshold, her mind spinning. Who was he? What did he mean by those words? Her heart was pounding in her chest, her palms tingling from the brief contact of the credits he had handed her. It was all so surreal, the way he had spoken to her, as if he saw something in her that no one else had ever bothered to notice. Her mind raced through 1,000 questions, but they all led back to the same thought. Was he really offering her an escape? She shook her head, trying to clear the fog that was clouding her thoughts. Of course, she couldn't just go with him. He was a stranger, a man from a world far beyond her reach. His words, though comforting, were nothing more than empty promises. He couldn't possibly understand her life, her struggles, the way people like her were bound to the dirt beneath their feet. But still, the idea lingered, like a whisper in the back of her mind, calling her to something more. What if she could leave? What if she could leave this forgotten outpost and find something different? Something better? The question gnawed at her, relentless, like a worm burrowing deeper into her thoughts. Rhea pulled herself out of her reverie and forced herself to focus on the task at hand. She had a job to do, and it wasn't going to finish itself. But even as she resumed cleaning her tools, her mind wandered back to him, the strange man who had appeared out of nowhere, his presence a stark contrast to the dreariness of this world. She couldn't explain it. There was something about him. Something magnetic. Something about the way he had looked at her, not with pity, like everyone else, but with an odd sort of reverence, as if he saw her as something more than what she had become. Rhea couldn't remember the last time someone had truly seen her, not as a mechanic, not as a worker, not as the poor girl from the forgotten world, but as someone with potential, someone worth something. The echo of his words lingered long after he had left. You've got more potential than you know. And with that single line, he had shattered her well-built walls of indifference. Rhea had been so careful to bury her hopes, to hide the fragile dreams she had once held tightly to as a child. Dreams of something more than this. Dreams of a life filled with adventure, filled with a sense of belonging in a world beyond the desert sands and the cold concrete walls. Those dreams were long gone, discarded in favor of the reality she lived in. But now, those dreams had crept back into her mind, unwelcome but persistent, refusing to be silenced. Rhea sighed, wiping her hands on her rag as she stared at the ship that was now ready for its owner to return. She glanced at the time. She had been lost in thought for far too long. With a final glance around the shop, she collected her tools and turned off the overhead lights, locking the door behind her. She couldn't afford to waste time on fantasies. There was work to do, and work was the only thing that had ever truly made sense. Chapter 2. The Proposal. The following days were a blur of routine. Rhea continued with her work in the shop, fixing broken-down ships and handling the usual flow of customers. The faces remained the same: traders with little to spare, smugglers with even less patience, and occasional travelers just passing through, looking for a quick fix. Yet, despite the steady rhythm of her days, the weight of the stranger's words gnawed at her from the back of her mind, like an itch she couldn't quite scratch. She kept waiting for him to return, for him to show up again, and perhaps clarify what he had meant. But he didn't. It was a few days later, when the sun was setting and the air had cooled slightly, that Rhea heard the sound of footsteps outside her shop. She didn't look up at first, assuming it was just another customer coming in for repairs. But when the door opened, and the familiar figure of the man from the other day walked through, her heart skipped a beat. "Didn't expect to see you again," Rhea said, trying to keep her tone casual, but failing. Her voice sounded tight, strained, like she had been holding her breath. The man smiled, his dark eyes locking onto hers in a way that felt strangely intense. "I had to come back," he said, his voice low and steady. He walked past her, glancing around the shop with an air of familiarity, though he had only been there once before. "I've been thinking about what I said." Rhea raised an eyebrow, trying to hide the flutter of nerves in her stomach. "And?" He turned back to her, his face serious now. "I meant it," he said, his voice uncharacteristically quiet. "You don't belong here, Rhea. You're meant for something more, and I can offer you that." She swallowed hard, unsure of how to respond. His words, so simple, yet so heavy, lingered in the air between them like a fragile thing that could shatter at the slightest touch. "I don't know what you mean. This is my life, my world. I can't just leave." "I'm not asking you to leave everything behind," he said, his eyes softening slightly. "I'm offering you a chance, a new life, one where you're not bound by the dirt and the dust of this place. I want to take you with me." Rhea felt her breath catch in her throat. She had been waiting for this, almost subconsciously, but now that the moment had arrived, she wasn't sure what to think. Her heart was racing, and the quiet part of her that had once dreamed of escaping, of finding something better, stirred awake. But there was something else in her that hesitated, that feared what this offer meant. She couldn't just throw away everything, could she? "Why?" she asked, the question escaping her before she could stop herself. "Why me?" The man paused, his gaze searching hers, as if looking for something he hadn't quite found. "Because you're the one person who's ever looked at this place and seen more than just its emptiness. You've got something inside you, Rhea. I can see it. You don't belong here. You belong out there." He gestured vaguely, toward the stars. "Out in the galaxy, where you can be more than just the mechanic, the girl with no future. I want you with me. I need you with me." Rhea's mind raced, her thoughts colliding in a whirlwind of confusion and hope. She had never been given an offer like this, never been asked to join someone else's life. She was used to taking care of herself, surviving in the shadows, working in the back corner of this broken-down shop. But this man, this stranger, had opened a door she hadn't even known existed. His offer was like a dream she had once longed for, but buried deep in her heart, too afraid to believe in it. He was asking her to take a step she wasn't sure she could make. "I'm not Dash," she began, but the words faltered in her throat. "I know it's hard to believe," he interrupted, stepping closer. "But think of it as a chance to do something more than just survive. Think of it as a chance to be something greater than what you've settled for. Think of it as a new beginning, Rhea. I can give you that." Rhea stared at him, her chest tightening as she thought about what he was saying. This wasn't just a casual offer, it was a promise. A promise of a different life, a life far beyond the limits of the dusty shop she had known her whole life. But could she trust him? Could she trust herself to take this leap? Before she could respond, he continued, his voice low and urgent. "Rhea, I want you to marry me." The words hit her like a physical blow, sending a shockwave of confusion through her body. "Marry him? Just like that?" "I know this sounds insane," he said, his eyes filled with a quiet intensity. "But it's the only way we can be free, truly free. You and I both know this place isn't where we belong. We need to escape, and I want to do that with you. Will you marry me, Rhea?" She stood there, frozen, the weight of his words settling around her like a heavy cloak. Her heart hammered in her chest as she tried to process what was happening. This man, this stranger, was offering her everything. A new life, a chance to leave this place behind. But was she ready for that? Could she trust him? Could she trust herself? And yet, as she stood there in the dim light of the garage, she realized something. She had always wanted this, even if she had never admitted it to herself. A chance to escape, a chance to belong somewhere, to be part of something bigger than the brokenness of her life. I don't know," she whispered, her voice barely audible, caught between the terror of the unknown and the possibility of everything she had ever dreamed of. He took a step closer, his hand reaching out, gentle but insistent. "You don't have to decide right now, but when you're ready, I'll be here. And together, we can make this dream a reality." Rhea stood motionless, her heart torn between the fear of the future and the hope for something more. The choice lay before her, and for the first time in her life, she realized that she had the power to decide her own fate. Rhea stood frozen, her mind whirling with 100 conflicting emotions. She had heard him, of course, but her brain couldn't fully process what he was asking. Marry him? Leave everything behind? How could anyone, let alone her, make such a monumental decision in the blink of an eye? Everything about the life she had lived up until now was grounded in survival, staying unnoticed, staying small, staying in the shadows. But this was a choice that would push her into the glaring light, into the unknown. It was a promise of something more, something beyond her wildest dreams. But the price for that dream felt too steep. What was the cost of taking such a leap? Could she trust him, a stranger who seemed to know more about her than she did herself? He stepped closer, his face earnest, his dark eyes searching her face for any sign of hesitation. "I'm not trying to pressure you, Rhea. I just need you to understand that this isn't just an offer. It's a chance, a real chance to get out of here, to leave all of this behind." He gestured to the dingy workshop, the dusty shelves stacked high with old parts, the flickering lights, and the emptiness of the space around them. "This place? It's not where you belong. It's not where you're meant to be." Rhea felt a pang of guilt twist in her chest. Could it really be true? Was she really meant for something more than this life she had carved out for herself? She had worked for so long to accept the quiet, humble existence of the mechanic in a backwater town, buried in her job, and pushing away dreams that had once seemed so unreachable. But here it was, an opportunity, an escape, something beyond survival. His words, though gentle, were like a quiet storm stirring the stagnant air of her existence. The rest of the world had always seemed so far away, so out of reach. But now, this man, this stranger, was offering to change everything. "I need some time to think about it," Rhea finally managed, her voice shaking with the weight of the words. She wanted to feel sure, to feel the certainty that this was the right decision. But her life had never been about certainty. It had been about getting through each day, one at a time, with nothing but grit and determination to keep her going. This was unknown territory. "Of course," he replied, his smile softening the edges of the tension in the air. "I won't rush you. But think carefully. This is your chance to step into a world that's so much bigger than what this place can offer you. With that, he turned to leave, but before stepping through the door, he paused and looked back at her. I'll be here when you're ready. Just don't take too long, Rhea. Life won't wait forever. His words hung in the air like a weight she couldn't escape, his presence lingering even as the door clicked shut behind him. Rhea stood there for a long moment, just breathing in the silence. She could hear her heart pounding in her ears, the intensity of the moment flooding her thoughts. What was she supposed to do now? She had always been a survivor, always adapted to the situation she found herself in. But this was the first time in her life where she felt like she was standing on the edge of a precipice, looking down at a future she could hardly imagine. The freedom he offered, was it really freedom, or just another trap? She didn't know, but for the first time, she realized that she wanted to know. Chapter 3. The Leap. Days passed, and yet, the memory of his words stayed with her. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the image of him standing in the doorway, his voice resonating in her chest, making it impossible to think about anything else. The city outside was as grim as ever. The same tired faces, the same people who had never given her a second glance. The same smog that hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Nothing had changed. Nothing had ever changed. But for Rhea, everything had changed. Her mind was no longer occupied with the menial work of repairing ships, the constant hum of the engines, or the sting of grease on her hands. No, she was caught in the whirl of possibility, the pull of an uncertain future. She found herself standing in front of the workbench, her tools set aside, staring out the window as her thoughts drifted to him. To the offer. What was she really afraid of? The thought of the unknown gripped her, but it wasn't just fear. It was the terror of never having the chance to see what might have been. The terror of staying stuck in the same place, of never knowing whether she could have done something different, something bigger, something meaningful. He had given her a chance, one she had never dreamed of. But how could she trust him? She didn't know him. He was a man of mystery, offering her a lifeline she had never thought possible. And yet, here she was, fighting the idea of stepping into a new life because of the very doubt that had held her back her entire life. But deep down, she knew. The life she had lived here, the life she had settled for, was never going to satisfy her. It was never going to give her what she wanted. It was just existing, and that wasn't enough anymore. Rhea had always been a survivor, but the more she thought about it, the more she realized that maybe it was time to stop surviving. Maybe it was time to start living, to choose something different, to choose the unknown. And so, after what felt like an eternity of silence and indecision, she made her choice. She couldn't wait any longer. She had to know. She had to see what lay on the other side of the door he had opened for her. That evening, as the twin moons began to rise in the sky, casting their pale light over the dusty streets of the city, Rhea made her way to the place she knew she would find him, the small, secluded cantina at the edge of town where travelers and outcasts alike gathered. It wasn't a place for anyone to take seriously, but it was where she had seen him before, and it was where she knew she had to go now. She walked through the door, her heart beating rapidly, her breath catching in her chest. The cantina was dimly lit, the air thick with smoke and the hum of low conversations. She scanned the room, looking for him, and then, at the far end of the bar, she saw him. His dark eyes were trained on her the moment she entered, and for a brief moment, it felt like the entire world stopped. "Rhea," he said, his voice quiet but warm, almost as if he had been expecting her. He stood up from his seat, and the way he moved toward her made her heart beat even faster. "I was hoping you'd come." She took a deep breath, steadying herself. This was it. No more doubts. No more second-guessing. She had made her decision. "I'm ready," she said, her voice firm, her eyes meeting his without hesitation. "I'll marry you." For a moment, he didn't speak, just looked at her, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he smiled, a smile that reached his eyes, making the tension in her chest ease just a little. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice thick with something like hope. "I'm sure," she replied, her heart pounding in her chest, but this time it wasn't fear. It was anticipation. "Take me with you. I'm ready for what comes next." Without another word, he reached out and took her hand in his, and for the first time in years, Rhea felt like she had a future that was hers to create. And as they walked out of the cantina, toward the unknown, toward whatever was waiting for them, Rhea realized something. She wasn't running away from her past. She was stepping into a future where she could finally be free. And that freedom, no matter where it led her, was worth everything. Ria's heart was pounding in her chest as she stood there, her hand in his, staring out into the dimly lit cantina. The moment stretched on, thick with possibility and uncertainty, but the hesitation she had felt earlier was gone. There was no turning back now, no more second-guessing. She had made her choice. She had finally taken that leap into the unknown, away from the familiar dust of the outpost, and into the promise of something more. His eyes met hers, steady and warm, as if he had been waiting for this moment just as much as she had. The hand that held hers tightened slightly, reassuring, grounding her. He said nothing for a moment, but there was something in his gaze, something that spoke volumes about the bond they had just formed in that instant. It wasn't a decision she had made lightly, but deep down, she knew it was the right one. She could feel it in the very marrow of her bones. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" His voice was low, but steady. He was asking, but the way he looked at her told her he already knew her answer. He believed in her, in them, more than she ever thought anyone could. She could see it in the way he watched her, like he was seeing the real her, not the girl who had learned to blend into the shadows, to hide from life's challenges. Ria nodded, her grip on his hand tightening. "I'm sure," she said firmly. "I've been surviving for far too long. I want more than just to live. I want to be." The words were foreign on her tongue, almost impossible to speak after so many years of hiding behind them. But there they were, coming out with clarity and intent. She was done just surviving. She wanted to be more, to be part of something bigger than the emptiness she had filled her days with. She wanted the adventure, the connection, the freedom that he was offering her. The freedom to leave this forgotten outpost, to step into the unknown. He smiled, a look of approval and perhaps even admiration crossing his face. "Then come with me. We'll leave this place behind, and we'll find what we're both looking for." Without another word, he led her out of the cantina and into the night, the cool desert air brushing against her skin as they walked toward the ship waiting just beyond the city. It was his ship, an unremarkable freighter, but to Ria, it felt like a gateway to the life she had always imagined but never believed she could have. The engines hummed softly as they boarded, and he guided her to the cockpit, where the controls lit up in front of her, the hum of technology pulsing beneath her fingertips. She could barely believe it. She was leaving. She was leaving everything behind: the small shop, the life of solitude, the quiet days of mediocrity. She had no idea where the journey would take them, but for the first time in years, Ria felt a flicker of excitement rise within her. She wasn't alone anymore. She had a purpose. She had a future. As the ship lifted off, leaving the dusty plains behind them, Ria looked out the viewport. The stars stretched out before them, vast and endless, a tapestry of possibilities. For the first time in her life, she realized that she wasn't bound by the limitations of her past. She was free, and whatever the future held, she was ready to meet it head-on. Chapter 4. A New Beginning. The days and weeks that followed were a whirlwind. As the freighter traveled through the galaxy, Ria began to see the universe for the first time, really see it. It wasn't like the hollow dreams of her youth. It wasn't just some abstract concept, something she had read about in books or heard from travelers passing through the outpost. It was real, and it was vast, with planets and stars and people she never thought she would encounter. She traveled through nebulae glowing with strange colors, past moons that shone with an eerie light, and into systems so far from her understanding that they felt like something out of a dream. With every passing day, she felt more alive, more connected to something greater than herself. She learned quickly, watching him pilot the ship, assisting with repairs, and helping him navigate the complex systems of the freighter. Every challenge, every new piece of knowledge, made her feel more and more capable. But more than that, it made her feel like she was part of something real. A team. She wasn't just a mechanic anymore. She was someone with purpose, with value. She had value beyond the limitations of this forgotten planet. One day, as they made their way toward a bustling trade hub, he turned to her and said, "I meant what I said, Ria. You've got more potential than you know. You've always had it, but now you've got the chance to put it to use. Together, we can do something incredible." His words hit her like a bolt of lightning, and she looked at him, the man who had taken her in, offered her this new life. His belief in her wasn't misplaced, she realized. It wasn't some false hope or an empty promise, it was truth. He saw something in her that she had long forgotten, something she could barely see in herself. And for the first time, she saw it too. But then, just as the freighter approached the trade hub, the reality of their journey hit her. It wasn't just a new life they were about to begin. There were risks, dangers, and enemies who might try to stop them. The galaxy was far from peaceful, and the adventures that lay ahead were going to test them both in ways they couldn't yet imagine. Rhea had never been part of something like this, in actual partnership. Not just survival, but true, honest living. It wasn't just about the dream anymore. It was about facing the challenges together, the unknowns, the hard decisions. They would have to rely on each other, not just for survival, but for something more profound. The ship glided into the bustling station, docking with a hiss of air, and Rhea could feel her pulse quicken. They were here. The universe had opened its doors to her, and she was about to step into it. "Ready?" he asked, turning to her with that same steady, sure smile. Rhea looked at him, her heart swelling with a sense of belonging she hadn't felt in years. "Let's go," she said, her voice steady, full of confidence. They exited the ship together, stepping into the hub of the station, a world of people, technology, and endless possibilities. This was it, the beginning of everything she had ever wanted. A future where she wasn't just an orphan mechanic stuck in a forgotten outpost, but someone who could make a difference, someone who mattered. And as they walked into the busy station, Rhea knew one thing for certain. This was her life now, her new beginning. And with him by her side, there was nothing they couldn't face.